HP alone PT8. It was close to dawn when Ron arrived back at Grimmauld Place. He tried to be all stealthy but forgot not just about the ward mat I had set up for Snape, not to mention the umbrella stand in the entrance which when he knocked it over set Mrs. Black off. "Shut your damn mouth, you annoying bitch," Ron yelled back at the shrieking painting as struggled to get the curtains that generally covered her shut. "It's about bloody time you're back," Harry said, walking into the hall to help him. "Sorry," Ron said sheepishly. "Where's Hermione?" "Asleep on the sofa in the sitting room. She fell asleep a while ago." "It's been an exhausting," he agreed. It was hard to believe that only a day ago, his biggest problem was trying to figure out a way to break things off with Lavender without hurting her too badly. Compared to what was happening now, it seemed so trivial. "What did you find out?" Harry asked. "Wake Hermione, I'll go find us a couple of glasses." "I picked up a bottle of fire whiskey." Ron raked his hand through his shaggy ginger hair. Harry started to say that they should let her sleep, then thought better of it. He liked his parts dangling just the way they were. "Is it that bad?" "It's pretty damn bad," Ron sighed. A quarter of an hour later they were all sitting in front of the fire holding mix-matched glasses. "So start from the beginning, what took you so long to get back?" Hermione asked. "I went to the leaky cauldron and sat in the corner freaking forever. The place was practically empty, which is very unusual. I mean, there are always patrons there. So I gave up and decided to go into Diagon Alley to see if I could find anything out. It was like a ghost town and the people who were actually on the street weren't exactly helpful. By that point the polyjuice potion was starting to wear off. I was close to Fred and George's place, so I figured it would be the best place to lay low and find out some information," Ron said. "They were back from the wedding?" Harry asked. Ron nodded. "Mum and Dad made them come back. They thought it would look suspicious. It's not like the Death Eaters are gonna let it out that they attacked my family's home trying to get at you." Hermione took a drink of her fire whiskey. "That makes sense. What did they say happened after the attack and we left?" "How's Ginny?" "Well, the Death Eaters are a bunch of pussies. After they saw us leave with Harry they fled," Ron said, then took a deep breath and took a long drink of the whiskey. "Dean was the only casualty." "And Ginny?" Harry asked. Ron let out a little bit of a laugh. "That is interesting. The official story is she's staying with my great-aunt Tessie." "And the real story?" Hermione asked. "She's with Victor Krum." "What?" both Hermione and Harry exclaimed together. "Krum saved her from some Death Eaters after Dean fell. He left with her, and until the house is secure she's staying put," Ron said as a flush crept up the back of his neck and spread to his face. It was clear that Ron wasn't as alright with the situation as he was trying to lead on. They both knew exactly how he felt about the Quidditch star. "So?" Harry cleared his throat. "And is there any other news?" Ron pulled a rolled-up newspaper from the inside of his robes and tossed it down on the coffee table, fresh off of the press. "After I spent so much time trying to get information, I figured what were a few more hours." "You're really not going to like it?" Hermione picked the paper up and paled when she saw Pius Thicknesse looking up at her. "No," she gasped. Harry took the paper from Hermione, his frown deepening. "So the attack on the Ministry of Magic was just a ploy to get Thicknesse in as minister and thereby Voldemort? I don't understand why he wouldn't just take it over himself," Ron said. "Since Dumbledore, well, he kinda is the most powerful wizard. I mean, it's not like we're ready for a full-on attack yet. It would be too easy. Why would Voldemort come out into the open when he can have a puppet in front of the world, while he's standing in the background pulling its strings? If people don't see Voldemort, That means Thickness can pretend like he's doing everything possible to stop him. Hermione said. That's the reason why I adore you. Harry said to Hermione and lifted her hand that he'd been holding and kissed her knuckles. Ron made a face. Please tell me that I'm not going to have to sit back and watch the pair of you snog. Nobody told you that you had to watch Ronald. Hermione said. Not to mention, for almost a full year you and Lavender spent all of your time snogging on every inch of the Gryffindor common room, the prefect bathroom. Oh, and the room of requirement. Harry grinned. Ron gave his best friend a murderous look but didn't say anything. Hermione made a face. The room of requirement, Ron? Honestly. Ron started to point out that Harry had done it first, but if looks could kill, well, he was pretty sure he would have been dead. I'm not the first one to have thought of it. He grumbled, glaring at Harry. Hermione had turned her attention back to the Daily Prophet and sighed, reading over the article about the appointment of the new Minister of Magic. This is not good at all. They swept the whole truth about Scrimgeour being murdered under the rug. They make it sound like a spell gone wrong, not a killing curse to the head. Well, we knew it would be like this. Ron said. It just really puts a damper on things. Not only do we have to figure out how we're going to get back to the burrow to get that bag, we also have to find RAB, the real locket, and the rest of the Horcruxes. This mission seems to be getting more and more impossible. Hermione replied. Harry frowned and looked at his girlfriend. He knew the thing about the beaded bag had really gotten her down. They'd always relied on her for her infallible ability to get them out of the worst situations. He just hoped he could get her out of this rut. Hermione had always been the reason he'd been able to go on so many times. If it wouldn't have been for the fact he knew that she was watching him, expecting him to be the hero he'd been dubbed as being from the time he defeated the Dark Lord as a toddler, he would have given up. He wondered if she knew how much power she held over him, and if knowing that would change how she felt about him for better or for the worse. It was the reason he could never tell her, because he wasn't sure if he would be able to get through all of this if it wasn't for the way she looked at him. We'll get this worked out, we always do. Hermione nodded. I hope so, Harry, I really hope so. Nobody said anything after that. They didn't need to. Things had just changed in their world, and they no longer had Dumbledore to protect them or to tell them the best course of action. They were alone, and the new world that was being formed was every bit of their worst nightmares. Victor was out of ideas. It had been almost a day and a half and Ginny still hadn't moved out of the window seat. She'd planted herself there after he'd brought her to his flat and stayed with her knees pulled up against her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She stared out over the city, her forehead pressed against the glass. At first he thought that she might have gone catatonic. He was worried about her. She had yet to eat anything and she was starting to look rather pale. The only acknowledgement she'd give him was to answer that she was fine, whenever he asked her questions. He knew she was going through a great shock and she probably should be with her people, not a dumb guy like himself. Still, he wasn't going to let her waste away on his watch. She had a whole family of insane brothers and Harry Potter looking after her. He wasn't willing to cross wands with any of them. He respected them too much. After nearly an hour in the kitchen, several attempts at making her tea, he finally emerged and sat down in front of her on the window seat. He held a small tray with a sandwich and a bowl of soup along with the tea. You must eat something, he said, the tray sitting on his lap. I'm fine, she said, not looking at him. You are not fine, you have not moved since I brought you here, Victor snapped, causing Ginny to jump. You have yet to eat anything. Ginny jumped and looked at him. I don't want to eat and I didn't ask you to bring me here. Would you have rather I left you to die like your boyfriend? He asked, his eyes narrowed in on her. I thought you to be much stronger than that. She narrowed her eyes, glaring at him. You don't know me, you don't know anything about me. What would you know about people dying? You've had everything you ever wanted, you bloody stupid git. No, I wouldn't know anything about that, would I? He snapped, his face turning red in anger. You think you're the only person who could understand what it is like to lose someone. I have lost everyone in my family, Ginny, everyone. Bulgaria is a far cry from England, there are constantly dark wizards trying to take over, Grindelwald was but the first of many vying for power. By the time I was 14 I was the only one in my family left alive. Let's not forget that Cedric was also my friend. I may not have yet to bury a lover, but that doesn't mean that I know nothing of what losses and what it does and how it feels. Ginny opened her mouth and then snapped it shut. She was ashamed of herself. In her own grief she's alienated the person who had taken it unto himself to make sure that she was all right. She'd thrown herself a pity party and wallowed in it. Victor, I'm sorry, she said, looking up at him. I am worried about you, Ginny, he said sincerely. He wasn't my lover, she said, her cheeks turning pink. Did you love him? He asked. She nodded, but not as much as he loved me, and he knew that. And you feel guilty that he is dead and you are alive? Victor said, sitting the tray he'd been holding on the small end table beside of her. Yes, she said softly, her soul was crying but her eyes were dry. Since Dean's death she'd done nothing but cry, she was out of tears. Victor cupped her chin in his hand. I am sure he knew how you felt for him. I think he would be disappointed to know that he gave you his life, you are wasting it sitting around and weeping for him. You are much stronger than this pathetic thing you are turning into. Thank you, Ginny said, looking up at him, her heart pounding in her breast. She knew that she shouldn't be feeling this way for someone else so soon after Dean's death. It was wrong. She couldn't seem to help it though. Drink your tea, he said, handing her the cup which had cooled. Ginny smiled at him before taking a sip of the warm liquid. It was all she could do not to spit it back into the cup. Well, he asked. It's bloody awful, she said with a bit of a laugh. Then you will have to teach me to make it to your liking, he said. I will, she said, looking up at him, their eyes meeting. Harry was sitting beside of the bed watching Hermione sleeping. His mind was full, and try as he might he hadn't been able to sleep. Afraid he'd wake her, he'd crawled from the bed they shared and was just watching her. Before he'd met her, while he was still living with the Dursleys at Privet Drive. If someone would have told him that he could feel this way for another person, he would have called them a bloody idiot. Harry, Hermione said sleepily, rolling over to face him. I'm here, he said from across the room. Hermione sat up and pushed her hair from her face. Why are you all of the way over there? She asked. Sorry. He couldn't help but grin. He crossed the room and climbed back into the bed with her. I just didn't want to disturb you. You don't disturb me, she said, snuggling in his arms, her head resting on his chest tucked under his chin. You have something on your mind. Nothing important, he assured her. Important enough that it drove you from our bed, she pointed out. You know me too well. Harry kissed the top of her head. I thought you loved that about me, she teased. I do. Then you should know me well enough to know you can tell me anything. Harry sighed and thought about it for a few minutes. I'm just starting to understand how Dumbledore must have felt. What do you mean? She frowned. Well, he had the weight of our world on him, didn't he? Both Scrimgeour and Fudge were constantly sending him owls for advice. He had to worry about all the students at Hogwarts and us getting into trouble. The more I think of it, the more I think he always knew what we were up to. Then he had to try to stay one step ahead of Voldemort and lead the order. Every time there was a death it hit him hard, He never showed it, but I know it ate at him. It's eating at me and I don't know if I can do it, Hermione. Dean's already dead and who's going to be next? You can't think like that, Harry. She said softly. Dumbledore was a great man, but there is one thing that you have that he didn't have. What's that? He asked, looking down at her, his hand running down her back. You're not alone, you're not bearing the weight of this by yourself. You have me and Ron and Ginny, Fred and George and Neville and Luna. Dumbledore knew that, and he made sure that you had people you could count on. Hermione said, looking up at him, her eyes full of love. You amaze me, Hermione. Harry leaned down and kissed her softly, his arms tightening around her. Harry. She gasped against his lips. You taste so sweet. He groaned against her lips before rolling to his side and her on her back. Hermione looked up at him, her hand catching the hem of his shirt, and pulled it over her head. It had seemed like forever since the last time they'd made love, rather than the handful of days it had actually been, and she wanted him more than anything. She didn't say anything as she trailed kisses down the side of his neck, her hands sliding over his abs, teasing his skin and causing goose flesh to rise. She liked that she had this effect on him. Hermione. He sank his hand in her hair, holding her against his skin. She was a little nervous. In their previous rounds of lovemaking, Harry had been in control, pleasuring her. She had no idea exactly what she was doing, she just hoped that she'd done this right. Her hands shook a little as she untied the strings to his pants and slid her hand inside. She wrapped her hand around his cock before sliding it slowly up the length of him in a gentle caress. Harry, show me what you like. She moaned softly against his ear. Harry growled in pleasure. He wasn't exactly sure how much of her tender play he'd be able to handle before she was flat on her back and he was deep inside of her. Still not wanting this to end too soon, he wrapped his hand around hers and showed her how to stroke him. Just like that, baby. He groaned, his other hand was still buried deep inside of her thick hair. He pulled her into a demanding kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth. Hermione was sure she'd never been so aroused in her whole life. Her heart pounded in her breast and her pulse was racing. She had no idea that giving another person pleasure could be so pleasurable. She broke the kiss and looked up at him, watching his face as she teased and caressed him. The last of Hermione's reservations had slipped away and she was feeling empowered by their play. She freed him from his pants and leaned down and flicked her tongue over the head of his shaft, causing him to jerk and hiss in pleasure. Fuck, Hermione. He groaned. If you do that, then I can assure this won't be lasting much longer. I just want to make you feel good. She said innocently, her eyes locking with his as she slowly took him into her mouth. Fuck, he cursed again, his hand fisting in her hair, his eyes rolling back in his head. Hermione moaned around him as she pulled slowly up on him. Over the years she'd heard plenty of older girls talking about this particular act. It always sounded disgusting and she could never see herself doing it ever. With Harry was different, with Harry everything was different. There was nothing disgusting about anything they did. He let her have her way with him for as long as he could possibly handle, still he wasn't ready to be done yet. He'd used every ounce of control he had to hold starve off his own pleasure. All right, Hermione, I need you now. He groaned, pulling her up by her arms. He jerked the t-shirt she'd been sleeping in up around her waist and ripped the band of her panties, pushing them out of his way, and buried himself inside of her with a groan. Wanting to feel his hands on her naked body, she tore the shirt over her head, dropping it to the floor, and arched her back, taking him deeper. Harry, I have no idea what to do. She sobbed. Just ride me. He groaned, his hands resting on her hips, squeezing them as he showed her how to rise and fall on his shaft. It didn't take long for her to catch on, and before they knew it they were both crying each other's name in pleasure. Hermione collapsed on top of Harry, breathing hard. That was. She gasped, her head was spinning, making it impossible to complete a thought. I agree, he said, trailing kisses over her naked shoulder. Harry woke with a start, as a blinding pain shot through his scar. He couldn't remember the last time he was plagued with dreams of the inside of Voldemort's head. In fact, he was pretty sure it had been since the vision of Voldemort killing Sirius that he'd had one. He'd just assumed that doorway linking their thoughts had closed that night, not to mention he'd always seemed more susceptible to them when he felt alone. It happening while he was holding Hermione in his arms, the safest place he'd ever felt, was as much of a shock as it was a violation. He kissed her gently on her forehead and untangled himself from her embrace. After pulling on his discarded t-shirt and jeans, headed downstairs and pounded on Ron's bedroom door. Up. Ron growled, still half asleep. Harry walked down to the basement where the kitchen was located and put on a pot of coffee. Normally he had tea at breakfast, but this morning he felt he needed the extra caffeine burst. Got some of that for me? Ron asked groggily. After they'd both finished a cup, Harry went over to the fridge and pulled out what they needed for breakfast. The dreams are back, he said nonchalantly as he scrabbled some eggs. Ron, who'd just taken a drink of his coffee, ended up sort of inhaling it, causing him to choke. I thought those were done. I assure you I'm more shocked than you are, not to mention the blinding migraine that goes along with it. Harry said he was still suffering from the side effects. It's a bit like the morning after having far too much fire whiskey. Maybe we did have too much last night. Ron suggested the last thing he wanted was for Harry to go through what he had during their 5th year at Hogwarts. I mean, it is possible, right? Harry shook his head. I only had a glass. Have you told Hermione? Ron asked. Not yet, I left her sleeping, he said. She needed the rest. So is it too much to hope that you know who was having a garden party with rainbows and kittens? Harry snorted a laugh. If only it were that simple. He's looking for someone, Gregorovitch. And one would assume that he's not planning a play date. Ron sighed. The name is familiar, I just can't place where I know it from. I keep thinking it's related to Quidditch, Harry said, sitting the prepared food on the table just as Hermione came in. Smells wonderful, she said, kissing Harry good morning before joining Ron at the table. Is everything all right? Define all right. Ron said, heaping food onto his plate as Harry poured Hermione a cup of coffee and topped his own off. The dreams came back, Harry said. Hermione gasped. Harry, this is terrible, you need to close yourself off from them. I can't, Hermione, I never learned how to do it. Harry snapped a little, causing her to frown. Besides, I don't think he's realizes that he's letting me in, I think he's starting become unstable. She frowned, but we don't know that for sure, I mean he could be setting a trap. No, I don't think so. Don't ask me how I know, I just do. Trust me, Hermione, Harry said, looking across the table at her. She sighed and went against her better judgment. All right, but we don't rush headlong into battle this time. We plan things out logically. Harry grinned a little. All right. Now tell me exactly what happened, she said. After breakfast they retired into the sitting room. Harry went over details from the dream, while Hermione logged them in a journal she'd found in one of the upstairs rooms. Even though the dream was simply a flash into Voldemort's psyche, more emotion than anything else, she still had a million questions. Almost to the point he was getting slightly frustrated with her. And you're sure that this person has to do with Quidditch? Hermione asked. Possibly, Harry said, I'm not exactly sure. You sure he wasn't saying like, Gorgovich? Ron asked. No, it was very clear Gregorovitch. Harry raked his hand through his ever-messy hair. This is so frustrating. We'll give it some time, It might come to you," Hermione said compassionately. Harry nodded. "It has him just as stumped as it does us, so we still have time to figure out what he's up to with this man. We need to get back to the burrow to find the bag," Hermione said. "Until we do, we're really at a loss of what we should be doing as far as finding the Horcruxes." "Agreed," Harry said. "Without it we're at a stalemate." Fred and George said that Mum and Dad haven't gone back yet. They wanted to be sure the place was no longer watched. Ron reminded them. "But the people who rented us the marquee will be out this evening to take it down. And if the bag is anywhere, it will be there. That's where I lost it," Hermione said. "All right, here's what we're gonna do," Harry said. 3 hours, and a dose of polyjuice later. They were standing outside of the burrow disguised in wizard robes similar to the ones that they'd seen the people who installed the tent the day before the wedding. The place was defiantly looking worse for wear. There were scorch marks marring the walls from spells that missed their marks. There were broken windows and some of Mrs. Weasley's prized plants turned over, their clay pots smashed. Even the garden seemed to be suffering under the torture it endured in the flight and fight that had taken place. The gnomes that were known to take up residence there had yet to come back out of fear. "We don't have much time, we need to start looking," Harry said. It was hard to believe that almost a week ago this had been a place filled with joy and happiness. He'd always seen this as his second home, Hogwarts of course being his first. There was no light or life here, and the sadness of it settled deep inside of him. He kept his wand drawn. They made their way to where the spell-damaged marquee was. Inside was dying flowers and overturned tables. The food on the buffet had started to rot. "I wonder if the safety deposit covers Death Eater attacks," Ron said, trying to lighten the mood. Harry laughed as they started looking under overturned tables. "Now that is an interesting idea, Death Eater insurance. Sounds like a scheme Mundungus would come up with," Hermione said. "We were near the dance floor when Victor came in." "Right," Ron said. "Do you have any idea where the dance floor might be at now?" Hermione looked around. There wasn't really anything that was still the way it was the night of the wedding. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes, trying to picture how everything had been arranged. "There," she pointed toward the place the dance floor had been. "You're sure?" Harry asked as he and Ron started to move overturned tables and chairs. "Positive," Hermione said. She just hoped that nobody picked the bag up. "Would this be it?" Harry asked, holding up a bag that looked like it had been put through a blender. Hermione nodded, sighing in relief. "Yes, now let's get out of here before someone realizes who we are." Over the few weeks, Ginny and Victor, they fell into an easy routine. If someone would have told her that she would have been comfortable being alone with an international Quidditch star, Ginny would have never believed them. Maybe it was because she'd known him since her 3rd year at Hogwarts and he was a good friend of Hermione, Harry, and Fleur that she felt this way. Maybe it was because he'd taken care of her while she was in a vulnerable state. She remembered the first time that she ever laid eyes on him, at the Quidditch World Cup. He'd seemed larger than life. Even when he was at Hogwarts for the Triwizard Tournament, it was almost like he was untouchable. She remembered back then, when Hermione had told her about him, she'd said that he was shy and didn't speak much. Since the night he'd snapped her out of her catatonic state, something had changed. She wasn't sure exactly what it was, but Victor wasn't shy with her. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He was rather candid with her. As the days moved on, the ache in her heart seemed to lessen, and she was sure Victor had something to do with it. She'd become so comfortable she'd completely lost track of time. That is, until Errol arrived with a letter from her mother, informing her that her father and Bill would be around to collect her the following afternoon. It wasn't so much the letter that caught her by surprise, but the date. There was only a week left of summer holiday. "Is everything good at home?" Victor asked when he saw Ginny's expression change. She nodded and folded the parchment back up and looking at him, "Yes, it looks like I'll be out of your hair. My father and Bill are coming for me tomorrow." Victor's expression darkened, "You've no trouble at all. I enjoy your company very much." Ginny smiled at him, her eyes twinkling. "I enjoy yours too. I'd very much like to continue to see you," he said, his brow wrinkling. Ginny's heart was pounding so hard that she was honestly surprised that he couldn't hear it. "I would like that very much." She was so surprised that she was stumbling all over her words. She was sure that he must think her a complete dolt. He smiled before cupping her cheek and leaning down to kiss her softly. He knew that it was probably too soon. Her boyfriend hadn't been dead a full month, but at the same time he had to. Since he'd saw her at the wedding, before the attack of the Death Eaters, he'd been thinking about her pretty pink lips. Being so close to her and not kissing her, all these weeks had been torture, pure and simple. He felt relieved when she took a step forward, closing the space between him, and slipped her arms around his neck. Ginny sighed softly and parted her lips, letting his tongue sweep into her mouth. She'd never had a kiss make her feel like this, not even with Dean. There were fireworks and all the bells and whistles described in those cheesy dime store romance novels her mother pored over. She knew that she should feel bad for this. Dean's memory deserved so much better than this. She would miss him every day. He'd been more than her boyfriend, he'd been a good friend too. She was alive, and Victor made her feel alive and whole. Slowly Victor pulled back and rested his forehead against hers as he looked down at her. He knew exactly where this would potentially lead them. He wanted more from her than a night of passion. He wanted the relationship with all the baggage. "VE should slow down," he said, both of them breathing hard. "But what if we never see each other again?" she asked. Victor pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We will see each other," he promised her. "I am not going anywhere. I will be close even when you are gone back to your home. I will be close, and when you need me I will be there. I'm holding you to that promise, Victor Crumb." She pulled back enough to reach into her pocket and pulled out one of the galleons the DA used to contact each other. "If I need you, this will grow warm. We use them when we need to get in touch with each other, and we don't want anyone to know. Owls aren't reliable anymore for secret stuff." Victor took the coin from her and frowned, studying it. "A fake galleon? I have never heard of this before." "Well, that's because it's something Hermione came up with," she said, then went on to explain what happened during her 4th year at Hogwarts and about Dumbledore's army. "And you plan to start back up this army?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Well, it's not really an army exactly. She thought about it for a few minutes. "Well, it's more of an association of like-minded people, who believe that who, along with all dark magic, should be stopped. We started it, well, see, because after he came back the Ministry of Magic didn't want to believe Harry and Dumbledore. Fudge thought that Dumbledore was after his job. The thing is, if Dumbledore wanted to be minister, he could have been probably a million times over. He thought that Dumbledore was having us trained to be his army, and he didn't want us to be taught to use defensive spells. So we decided to branch off on our own. But we're about more than just learning spells. We're about helping people and doing what's right. People are being murdered left and right. The Ministry of Magic isn't doing anything to stop it. Even before Scrimgeour was murdered, they were more about hiding the truth and telling false stories. They think the wizarding world can't handle the truth, but they're wrong." "And you lead this group?" he asked, rolling the coin over in his fingers, studying it. Ginny blushed a little. "No, Harry and Hermione are the real leaders. Of course, in light of everything that's happened, they can't go back to Hogwarts. It would be dangerous." Even though she trusted Victor more than anything, she still couldn't tell him that Harry, Hermione, and Ron were going on a special mission. They were right when Harry said the less who knew the details he better. Harry made Neville the leader with Luna, Lavender, and I assisting. "And you must be a Hogwarts student to be a member," he asked looking up at her. He was sure that he'd never seen her look more beautiful. Her face was flushed and her eyes full of fire. He liked seeing her passionate about something. "Oh no, Fred and George are also members," she said, surprised. Victor nodded. "I'd like to help," he said. Ginny blinked. "You would?" "I cannot allow my girlfriend to endanger herself while I only watch," he said with a smile. "Your girlfriend?" she asked, surprised. "Yes, my girlfriend, unless you object." "No, not at all." Ginny leaned up and kissed him softly. Harry, Hermione, and Ron were elated when they made it back to Grimmauld Place. Their plan had gone off without a hitch, really. Of course, after arriving there, Harry realized that they probably could have walked into the burrow wandless and without their clever disguises, and nobody would have been the wiser. Still, it proved that they were able to come up with well thought out plans and execute them. "So how much damage was done?" Harry asked once they were settled in the setting room. "I don't know yet," Hermione said, running her fingertips over the small bag before pulling the drawstrings open. "Be careful," Harry said, knowing that there could be anything in there. "That's a little redundant, isn't I mean, it's Hermione we're talking about," Ron said. "Funny, Ron," Hermione shot him a look, then peered inside of the bag. "Well?" Harry prompted. "Since it's all going to have to be repacked anyway," she pulled a throw off of the back of a sofa and laid it out on the floor. "What are you doing?" Ron asked, confused. "Checking our supplies," Hermione said before carefully spill the contents onto the blanket. "I figured that if anything was broken it would be easier to clear away like this." Harry and Ron stared in awe as Hermione continued to shake things from the bag until she was up to her knees in clothes, books, sleeping bags, a tent, and anything else Shed thought they would need. "I told you it had everything," she said, looking at the boys. "What would we do without you?" Harry asked. "I ask myself the same question every day," Hermione said in a teasing voice. "How?" Ron asked. "Undetectable extension charm," Hermione said, sitting down in front of the pile to start sorting it out. "Honestly, Ron, you grew up in the wizarding world. Surely this isn't new to you." Ron frowned. "Well, no, but that's a really little bag," he defended himself. "I figured it would be easier to conceal if need be," she said, then looked up at the boys. "Am I going to have to do this all by myself?" She raised an eyebrow at them. "No," Harry said as he and Ron moved quickly to the floor to help her. "Be careful, there are files of potions and ingredients I thought we would need. Some of them can be quite harmful," she said. "We'll need to laundry the clothes just to be safe." "We'll get it all straightened out," Harry assured Hermione. "I think it might be a good idea that when we repack to organize it. Maybe have all the potion stuff together." "Why do we need all these books?" Ron asked, stacking them together. "Because we have no idea what we are coming up against." Harry said that the magic used to protect the fake locket in the cave had been unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Hermione reminded him. "Besides, we're not exactly going to be able to run to the library whenever we come across something that we're not sure about." "You said there was nothing in the library about the Horcruxes," Harry said, confused. A look of slight guilt crossed Hermione's features. "That's because someone had already removed them from the library." "Dumbledore," Harry said in surprise. "It would make sense, he had suspected who made the Horcruxes even before he got the real memory from Slughorn. It would have made sense for him to take them out of the library not just to study but possibly to keep another student from stumbling on that information." It almost makes going back to Hogwarts worthwhile. Dumbledore probably destroyed them though, wouldn't he? Ron said. Hermione shook her head and pulled several very old tomes from the pile Ron had made. He only removed them. Merlin's beard, Hermione. Ron gasped. How the hell did you get your hands on those Horcrux books? Well, it wasn't stealing their library books. Hermione defended herself. After Dumbledore's funeral I thought of it. I mean, he would have wanted us to have them so we could find out as much about them as we could, so I used the summoning charm and oxioed them from his office to the girls' dormitory. And if he wouldn't have wanted us to have them, he would have hidden them better. Harry gave her a big grin. You're brilliant, Hermione, he said. I'm a little confused though. I mean, we know about them, those books aren't going to tell us where to find them. Ron pointed out. Yes, but they'll tell us how to destroy them, Hermione said. I hadn't even thought of that, Ron said lamely. I mean, I guess I've been more focused on finding them. I think our best bet would be starting with R.A.B, Harry said, pulling the fake locket from the moleskin bag Hagrid had given him. Do you think that there is any chance that he might have destroyed the real one? Ron asked. I think anything is possible, but we still have to find him to be sure, Harry said. Then we'll go from there. Do you have any ideas? Hermione asked, carefully picking broken glass from the fibers of one of her sweaters. Sort of, but nothing really solid. There is a pattern, at least with 2 of the Horcruxes. Dumbledore said he found the ring in the cottage on the edge of the Riddle Manor. And the cave was a place where he'd went as a child on holiday with the orphanage he grew up in. Then the items themselves are connected too. The diary, of course, was connected directly himself. He'd written it while he was at school at Hogwarts. The locket was his mother's and the ring his grandfather's. Both of them were connected to Salazar Slytherin and connected him to not only the wizarding world but Hogwarts as well. We also know that he killed for the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, so there stands a chance, a very good one, that he made it into a Horcrux as well. Hermione knew that Harry hated the fact that he'd had one thing in common with Voldemort, that they'd both never knew a home until they came to Hogwarts. What about the orphanage? She asked. Do you think he would have hid one there? No, because when he found out that he was a wizard, he did everything that he could to shed himself of his Muggle life, Harry said. Yeah, he wouldn't want any reminders of that. I mean, he didn't even keep his Muggle father's name, Ron said. Harry sighed. I really wish Dumbledore was here. Hermione reached over and squeezed his hand gently. We all do, and he wouldn't have left you with an impossible task. It seems that way though, Harry said. Please like and subscribe.